Exclusive. Professor exposes amplified hysteria, panic and economic misery. Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of people. Hi, John.
Hi, sir. How are you going?
Pretty good, you?
Doing well.
Great. Now we have a special guest today, so do the introductions.
Sure. So we do have a special guest today. So just to give the context for the audience, Martin, you and I have had a couple of conversations already about COVID-19 in the context of in terms of the decision to lock down the Australian economy and the impacts of that lockdown. And a lot of people are sort of are going through a lot of turmoil because of this particular decision. You and I have not seen sort of eye to eye on some aspects, particularly around the severity of the virus. But what we've said in some of our previous shows is neither you nor I are experts on viruses and in terms of biology, etc. So I thought what would be beneficial to actually help shape the conversation is to bring a expert in the field who has been closely studying the coronavirus, COVID-19, at a very detailed sort of molecular level. So I'm proud to introduce. We have Professor Ted Steele, who's an Australian professor specialising in molecular, who's a molecular immunologist. And like I said, he's been studying for the last several weeks the DNA and RNA COVID-19 sequences with samples coming out of Wuhan, China, and the United States. So the professor has a long, distinguished career in science, and he has a number of very important observations to make in terms of what he's been able to find. And so what we're going to do with this conversation today is we're going to really tackle two core scientific questions. One is, how serious is COVID-19 in terms of it being a virus? And two, where do we think it originated from? So without further ado, welcome, Professor Steele. Thank you for coming on the show. And just to get started with our audience, can you just tell us who you are, your current position, your career history, and what expertise do you have in discussing COVID-19?
Well, first of all, I thank you both for inviting me on. First opportunity to publicly ventilate these explanations, which are scientific. I'm a biomedical scientist, 50 years standing. I'm 71 years old. I've published upwards of 100 peer-reviewed papers in the scientific literature and edited or authored 5 or 6 books. I can't remember the others. One, I think, in the pipeline. I got my PhD in 1975 in molecular immunology at the University of Adelaide, working on infectious diseases. And since then, I've worked on the mechanism of somatic hypermutation, that is, how antibodies diversify in the body in response to vaccines or immunisation. And I've also worked on the mechanisms of evolution of life on Earth, Lamarckian feedback evolutionary mechanisms. And that's all led naturally with all my work on hypermutation, reverse transcription, deaminases, has all led naturally to working with Professor Chandra Wickramasinghe in the UK on astrobiology and the origins of life in the universe. And we've been publishing on that for about 4 or 5 years now, but we've sort of been caught completely by surprise by COVID, because we've been writing about all these sorts of things, and now a real-time event has emerged, and we've been following it extremely closely.
That's great, and very much appreciate your time. And as you say, this is the first time really that you've been able to present your ideas to an audience. And, we think that this is a very important voice and a very important perspective that should be ventilated. Some people will find some of what you say surprising, possibly, maybe even shocking. But nevertheless, we think in the interest of the people, it's very important that these perspectives are actually aired. And as you say, John, we're going to basically look at 2 aspects. The first is the seriousness of COVID itself, and then secondly, some discussion perhaps about origins of the virus too.
So when analyzing the RNA and the DNA sequences of COVID-19, which you've looked at, from China to the United States. So I've got a couple of questions about that. So the first one is, so when you actually study these sequences, I mean, what are you actually looking at, and why is it important to study these sort of DNA and RNA sequences? How did you obtain the sequences, and what's the source, and what has your analysis revealed to date?
First of all, by understanding the source of mutations in the virus and the genetic signatures in the virus, you can actually help understand the origin of the virus and the way it's spread globally. However, and I get that the data is publicly available, curated by the National Institutes of Health in the United States, and that data can be downloaded and used. You can use the analytical tools. They've been very, very good. They've provided all sorts of tools for sequence alignment and analysis, and I can do all sorts of detailed studies on the locations and the significance of all of the different mutations that I see in the virus. But the most important thing for me in the analysis is understanding the explosive events of this virus. The original event in Wuhan, in Hubei province in China, is the key. And also the temporal sequence. I'm not studying everything around the world. I'm just studying the key temporal sequence in the first 2 months, two and a half months. So the explosive event in Wuhan is key. The next major events outside China were outbreaks on the western coast of the United States, in California, Washington State, and the Grand Princess cruise ship. Then it became clear to us that a lot of countries were not getting this virus, but there was also a very striking pattern in the way the explosive events then occurred through Tehran, Italy, Spain, and we recognised very early on, sometime in February, that all the explosions were occurring on a north 40-degree latitude band. And if that kept up in that temporal sequence, then New York was likely to get hit. So we predicted the New York explosion. So I've been analysing all of the sequences now from all of these key temporal events, and it gives much insight into this virus, in my point of view anyway, on how the mutations get generated and what it says, and that signal, what it actually says about the origin and spread. This really is, I think, a fairly ordinary common cold virus, not as complex as influenza or HIV by any stretch of the imagination, but it certainly uses, like all viruses, tricks in adapting to its environment. And the environment in this case are human beings or animals. It may be also infecting animals as well, which we haven't really investigated yet properly. But certainly human beings are the prime target. And the level of lethality, I can only go on all of the numbers that are being produced. First in Wuhan and in New York City. At the height of the epidemic in New York City, there was still only, when I think we could believe the numbers, and I'll qualify that later, it looked like about 2 to 4% were being targeted for lethal outcome, not death, but potentially lethal outcome. And they were the elderly comorbids. Most of the rest of the population seemed to be okay. My main goal has been to understand that temporal sequence of explosive events in terms of the genetic sequence of the virus.
Because Martin and I did a show early on, in terms of this sort of pandemic, and particularly around late January, we did a show and we were talking about some of the early reporting we saw in the mainstream media, and there was some discussion about that this virus had elements of bats and snakes, and there was even some stories that HIV had been found in the virus itself. So on these particular points of what is actually in the virus and what consists of the virus, I mean, can you speak to, did you see elements of animals or HIV or anything else in the virus itself?
Well, first of all, I think both those stories, well, I presume you also mentioned the bioweapon there and that, but both those stories to me are just fantasy stories. I'm sorry, as a scientist, critically looking at all the data, I can't take any of them seriously. However, the animal jump theory, has been fueled a lot by all sorts of stories over the years. In every case of a suddenly emerging disease, there's always an animal origin that they have to point to. And in every single case, even in the case of HIV, that's never been proven. There are relationships between the so-called animal viruses and the human viruses. No question about that. You use phylogenetics to do that, but that's not the causal relationship. That's always been overlooked. And in the case, let's just deal with corona. Here, if you're going to go onto the animal model with corona, you have to go through, because of the number of steps involved, you have to go through 2 animal steps here. So the usual story is you begin with a bat having the original progenitor of COVID-19, which is a large number of mutational steps from the one that we see. And then, so they have to invent an intermediary animal for that to make sense. So they invent X. Now, X at the moment is pangolin. That is a highly sought after wild animal in China as a succulent dish, a food dish. So pangolins is X at the moment. And then humans eat animal X, and then they get the virus by a jump. Look, of course, the chain is plausible. But as I say, the chain like that has been invented for every single suddenly emerging diseases that in the last 100 years. There's no hard evidence for it. That's all I'd like to say. A lot of assumptions, and the plausibility only comes down to the evolutionary relationships. But you can draw up evolutionary relationships amongst many, many biological sequences. And with the virus, that's its main evidence. My reading of all the evidence is that this is a normal common cold virus trying to adapt. Forget about the explosions for a minute. Trying to adapt to its environment in the best way it can. And it's got a number of tricks. I don't want to go into the molecular details for a number of reasons. It would just be too detailed, but I don't want to give some of my competitors, the go-to on how I've solved the problem. But I believe I have solved the problem, by the way. I've actually solved the genetic problem for COVID-19. Now, that will seem like a Muhammad Ali statement, but that's fine. I know I've solved it. Now,
sorry, can I just ask one question, Ted? Because it seems to me that what you're actually saying is, if you've got a set of implicit assumptions that the virus is actually spread through the animal kingdom into humans, then you're going to spend all of your time and effort essentially trying to make that track those connections. In fact, it's hard to prove. Is that fair?
And never been proved in any case in
Yeah.
history. They've never been able to prove it. But
Right.
they always point to the phylogenetic relationship. Oh, there, it must have happened. But they've never been able to prove it.
Right. So the point there is, if you start from a different place and say, well, actually, there are maybe other routes that viruses could take to actually enter the environment here, then maybe you start from a different place and therefore you're looking for a different set of connection points.
The virus, let's get something clear. That's why understanding. The virus must negotiate its genetic outcome. That is the sequence that I get to look at. It's a game between the host and the parasite. It's a negotiated genetic outcome. I want to leave you with that thought, because that's very, very different from a rampant spreading virus that's hypermutating and hitting everything. It's got to negotiate every single encounter. That's actually a very important concept that's been totally overlooked. Yeah.
Now, just on that, let me just drill down slightly and say, when you say negotiate, what exactly do you mean by that, Ted?
In a biochemical sense, host-parasite relationship. The host wants to kill the virus off. The virus wants to replicate, which will kill the host. But so there are attacks being made on the virus. Many of the viruses do get lost, but the survivors can replicate comfortably in that environment. So that's what I mean by negotiation. And in a different genetic background, say in a different racial genetic background, it will replicate a slightly different form, one of these tricks that I was telling you about before. So it's always a negotiated outcome and what we actually see.
So can you just go into some detail about what you found on the mutation front, and why is that important to understand the nature of the virus and where it may have come from?
Yeah, it's a very good point. Yes. So first of all, I should say that the first person to see this low mutation and sort of and trees that were quite bland was Dr. Kirsten Anderson from the Scripps Clinic. And as I got into these sequences, I actually confirmed that and could see that, and I've seen that now in many other places. But I've really got to make a clear statement here about that discovery and others. And I've got to acknowledge my collaborator, Dr. Robin Lindley from GMDX Genomics in Melbourne, because I work in close association with them. So these discoveries, which I will give in general outline, are in association with her work. I've just got to get that priority and establishment of association clear now before we start. But anyway, let me just say this, that those low mutation rates and other features, they by themselves certainly suggest an incoming common source, but by themselves they do not sort out the problem, because these phylogenetics methods that are used to determine just that is trees, building a Darwinian tree, they won't help you understand this virus. That's become absolutely crystal clear to all of the sequences I've looked at and all the groups in all those key locations, explosions versus more pedestrian spreads. Because there are extra qualitative tricks the virus has over and above just simple mutation. And by the way, those tricks give the appearance of rapid change of the virus. So people think, it's hypermutating and that sort of thing, but it actually isn't. It isn't doing that. Now I know that might sound contradictory, but it isn't. These are standard tricks of adaptation that viruses use, and many other organisms use tricks like this too. So it's nothing strange. It's just that COVID-19 is getting really well studied. There are lots of examples everywhere and lots of sequences. But in that, when you condense it all down in explosive outbreaks, and in the case, for example, on the Grand Princess, where we have a lot of a cruise ship, a lot of data, it comes down to low mutation and these tricks that I'm telling you about, where it can change it can change its mode of replicating. So. But that's in a second category to a low mutation. That's all I want to say. So I know that won't necessarily make everyone happy. It's because I don't want to fully give away the nature of our discovery. We've made a very important discovery on the way this virus is working. It's not just not mutation and low mutation. It's what it does with the mutation. But of course, just blandly looking at it, it would look like that. Now, just on the final comment on the trees, I would imagine that many of the people that are building trees in different locations around the world, particularly in New York City, because I know that's where most of the action is now, they would be horrified by the shape of their trees. They would look like mangrove swamps and therefore unintelligible to a conventional Darwinian operator. But that's because of all these qualitative tricks of the virus. That's my view. So I'll leave detailed comment there on it, if you don't mind.
So can you just elaborate as to why, if there is a low level of mutation, why this is sort of significant for in terms of particularly understanding from a public health perspective?
Yeah. The particular problem would be in these infall zones where you have low mutation, and it would look like that from my perspective, because most of the patients that have been targeted for sequencing, of course, have been probably the comorbids. We don't have that information on the sequence. So everything that's been targeted for sequencing has been important, information to get. And many of them would show these low mutation rates of the type that I'm saying. And in some cases, like in Wuhan and the Grand Princess cruise ship and probably other places as well, the low mutation could very well be associated with the fact that these elderly comorbids are not mounting an adequate innate immune response to try and cripple the virus, whereas more healthier people these deaminase mutagenic responses that are harnessed by the body's the cells of the body to get rid of the virus are working better in healthier people than unhealthy people. So the low mutation in some ways is a reflection of the fact that the elderly comorbids, let's say, as a group, are the ones that are being targeted best. The virus grows rapidly, doesn't need to without any mutation, because the host is not directing any mutagenic attack on it. So compared with, let's say, 2 or 3 months ago, the insight now into this virus it's just subtly different. Have you noticed that? I know John's noticed it. And so the low mutation is also partly due to the fact that I suspect that many of the comorbids are just simply not mounting a mutagenic response against the virus. And that would happen in an infall. High dose infall is just exactly what you'd expect to happen. Totally consistent with that.
So the decision to lock down the Australian economy and economies around the world. So we know that the Doherty Institute, who's been advising the Prime Minister and the National Cabinet, it came out with initial projections based on simulated modelling to say that if left unmitigated, 150,000 Australians would die from COVID-19. We know that Neil Ferguson from Imperial College also advised WHO, the UK government and others to say that, and they also published it on their website to say that if unmitigated, 40 million humans worldwide would die from COVID-19. So obviously when a politician gets scientific advice with those sort of projections, politicians have to respond because these numbers are quite frightening. So I guess and you've sort of touched on this in the issue of lethality, but obviously when you look at infection rates, the deaths attributed to COVID-19, and the question of how lethal it is. When you look at these initial projections that drove the decision to lock down the economy, I guess, yeah. So how lethal is COVID-19, and how statistically significant is COVID-19 different from, say, influenza?
Okay, let's just deal with the last ones first. Yes, look, all I can go on is all the other, the numbers we all have available. Influenza each year, and in its major pandemics, have exacted far greater tolls in terms of death rates than COVID-19 at the moment. I think the key is understanding dose in the epicentres, because I think that's what's causing most of the deaths, to be quite honest. Secondly, the target group, as I've mentioned, the numbers in New York still say that the target group is still the comorbid elderly group. So let's just look at another number, very important. It's not often discussed. We now know from 2 independent population studies that 20% of the population develops antibodies to COVID-19. That means 20% of the population are developing what's called adaptive acquired immunity, just like you'd get if you got vaccinated. That means 80% of the population, in my mind, as an immunologist, have successfully rejected this virus in the first 24 to 48 hours. That is, by the innate immune response. And that's what I study in studying these genetic signatures, by the way. So 80% get rid of the virus rapidly. Healthy people with a functioning innate immune system, not the adaptive system which occurs later. The one in the first 48 hours, they just get rid of the virus. Then those that don't, the virus grows and immunises them. And if you're a comorbid elderly, say a 20th of that number, 20%, say 1% of that 20%, the 1% component of that 20%, then you are in trouble, because it's a respiratory virus, and anyone with respiratory problems like me, and you're elderly, with asthma, and with all sorts of other things to do with diabetes, obesity, or heart disease, that's clear you're vulnerable and you have to be looked after. I've always said right from the start that group had to have special attention paid to them. Everyone else is going to be able to handle this virus. So in terms of lethality, it is a common cold virus that would come every year. The difference with this virus are the explosive events we've seen around the world, and the fact that it's getting microscopic attention from the scientific community in ways no other common cold virus has ever received in history. In fact, we have more genetic sequences now on this common cold virus in such a short time that it's just mind-blowing, the number of sequences. So I can't analyse them all. If I analyse those key sites. So what I'm leading up to is this. If, say, in previous years past, we put a common cold spread around the world under the same microscope, we'd probably see the same story I'm reporting here now about the genetic tricks that this virus uses. And it's always been the case that if you're elderly and you're in a nursing home, and if you're compromised with asthma and other respiratory problems, the last thing you want to get is the common cold or the flu. You avoid them like the plague, to use a pun. Okay, thank you. No, you do. You want to watch me moving around my own local habitat here. I'm still wearing a mask, and I'm doing it because I don't want to be treating myself for the complications of even another common cold, not necessarily COVID. At the moment, the atmosphere is so hysterical that very few people are listening to these sorts of stories. Yeah, good, thanks.
Sure. So, I mean, one follow-up, Ted, is in terms of these initial projections that the simulated modelling came up with. I mean, you being a professional scientist, what do you make of scientists going to political leaders saying that hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people would die if you don't take specific action?
Well, yeah, it's not just Niall Ferguson, but the advisors to President Trump have been making ridiculous claims like that too. Look, I think it's irresponsible, quite frankly. But then again, I don't have the normal modus operandi or the normal routes to advise politicians and scientists. I do know this, that through my supporters in Australia, all of this information you're telling you now has been brought to the very firm attention of Scott Morrison, Peter Dutton, and the whole inner circle are aware of this story that I'm recounting now, fully aware of it, but they've decided not to run with it. And our recommendations that we behave like Sweden, for example. All of the genetic, immunologic, epidemiologic, geophysical, astrophysical, and astrobiological evidence is consistent with an infall of viral laden meteorite dust from space a few weeks before the epidemic started to appear. The fuse in Wuhan and Hubei. It occurred just north of Wuhan. Chandra Wickramasinghe has done the calculations on the angle that the cometary fragment came in, and its trail, and then its explosion, and it would have hit Wuhan directly. It would have been a direct tip if there was infall of the meteorite dust at the time of the explosion in the stratosphere. So that's where it came down. And if you look at the dose case pattern at Wuhan, just take the Johns Hopkins, those Johns Hopkins graphs for the pattern. It looks like a central massive epicentre on Wuhan, and then a radial spray, as if the spray from a bomb going off, dropping out the radial spray. And in fact, literally, we think that's what happened. The central China got massively contaminated with viral laden dust particles at very high concentration. And this is key because this has not come up in any discussion that I've read in the media. Very high dose hit Wuhan. I also think, and Chandra agrees with me, and all my other co-authors agree with me, that a high dose hit Tehran, Lombardy in Italy, Spain, and a super high dose hit New York City. All the other places in the world are low-level community spreads, minor outbreaks, or what I call jet-ins, infected people jetting into countries like Australia. Australia has not experienced anything like what's happened in the Northern Hemisphere in any shape or form. The explosive events at its epicentre took everyone's attention. There's no question that through January, we were getting images of Wuhan, which were absolutely terrifying. I think somewhere along the line here, John, wants to talk about, it looked like the plague of Athens, the one that occurred where people were dying in the street. And there were all these rumours, and we could never verify them coming out of China. I think all of Wuhan can be understood as super high dose on these grounds. If you get a super high dose of anything, you'll die. If you get a super high dose of a common cold virus, say 100 or 1,000-fold higher than what you'd normally get, even a young person could die. And certainly old people will be just taken out swiftly. We'd be like the sword of Damocles. He's coming straight down on them. So I think dose is the key here. And in all the epicentres, Wuhan, Tehran, Italy, Lombardy, Spain and New York, dose is key in the environment. It's everywhere in the environment at high dose. So social distancing, all these are just meaningless in an epicentre like that. And it's everywhere. It's on the vegetation, it's on doorways, roads, railings, keys, your hair, your clothes, wild animals, domestic animals, your pussycats, your stroke. I've got it in their fur, the dogs. It's everywhere. And how long it lasts in the environment is another matter. It certainly lasts in the meteorite dust for a while, but how long it lasts in the environment is another matter, and that's probably got to be determined. But it's the dose is the key to understanding this virus. And the genetics, whilst interesting, and showing a common cold adapting to its environment. That's another story. I could talk in more detail if you want. It's these key events that have taken place. And I think that's what's attracted the world's attention and why it's panicked everybody, actually. If this had happened in the past with one of the flus, like a major city being struck in China, let's say it's in China, I'll get back to that issue too, while China gets the blame for all this. So it's most unfortunate that's happened. But if that had happened with some other virus and in the same way, we would also have been attracted. If it had just emerged slowly and episodically around the world, it probably wouldn't have caused as much hysteria. But it was that initial event through January on our TV screens of what happened in Wuhan, all the rumours. I was getting phone calls from all sorts of people giving me rumour. And I said, well, I just don't know. I can't evaluate it. But, the idea that there were large numbers of deaths, men in moon suits running around with spray guns, they certainly weren't chasing bats or pangolins. They were trying to extinguish, trying to get rid of something from the environment. Machinery. Yeah, and that really touches on the economic and political consequences and why bioweapons have come in. And I'll deal with that later. The bioweapon story can be disposed of. But China behaved rationally. I think by the middle of January, it knew the contamination was region-wide throughout its industrial heartland. And that's a horrible position for a government, let alone a communist Chinese government, to be put in. Because any government then would have behaved the way China behaved. Okay, let's determine the extent of the contamination. What do? We can lock everyone down, because they locked everyone down. Make sure everyone wears a mask. I'm sure a lot of people died in Wuhan during that period. Then they doused the streets, all the machinery. Then the horrible thought, we've been packing away all these goods on the container ships for export to the world. Multiple computers, plastics, linen, papers, everything. And they could all be contaminated. So can you see the response from the Chinese government was quite rational, really. Now, why they've let wet market stories run and why they haven't acknowledged that it could have been something extraterrestrial like a meteorite, given their long historical traditions in China of monitoring these things. They do. They have a very long, much more than the West, academic record of understanding pestilence often follows meteorite strikes in China. And then that leads to the next question: why China? Let me answer it now. I'm sure people are interested. The Earth has a crossing pattern through the meteorite. It's called the Orionid meteorite stream, and the Earth crosses that, and particularly it strikes China and Siberia, October, November every year, like clockwork. So half the time, if nasty things come in, China's going to get the blame for it. You think about it. Massive population of human beings, a massive animal population. Something's going to take, whether it's a swine flu or a bird flu, a flu, or in this case, a coronavirus. And it's got nothing to do with eating animals. Because then you have to, the explosion of event in Wuhan is on such a scale that you have to evoke millions of pangolins being eaten for it to explode like that suddenly. And that's an absurd theory. But look, I'll deal with the bioweapon. I can deal with the bioweapon theory more thoroughly shortly, but I just wanted to give you a more deeper insight in the way we were thinking through December, January, because Chandra and I, and Reg, because we were monitoring it very carefully. We're analysing all the data coming in. And then it became clear when the sequences became available that I would be dedicated to analysing the sequences, because I could do it. So that's where we're at. So we realised that it was on its way to Europe through the north 40-degree latitude band from stratospheric winds. And then there was another one moving across the Pacific, which we think hit the west coast of the United States, California and Washington State, sometime through February, particularly late February, and the Grand Princess cruise ship, which was off the coast of California. So, to us, there's a lot of evidence for this temporal chain and cause and events. Now, what we lack, of course, is proof of the meteorite on the ground and the dust. All of that is hard to get. Although I've heard that a lot of Chinese people, with one of our contacts in China, told us that a lot of pieces of that meteorite were actually picked up by people. But that would be interesting to look at that. I wanted to give you an idea of the coherent nature of the thinking behind this whole causal event.
Right.
That's all.
But what we're saying then is there are actually two types of spread with regard to this virus. The first is effectively coming in from outer space in some way and hitting a few different targets, and that's where you get the high concentrations. And then beyond that, there's community spread, and that community spread essentially is more normal in terms of transmission. But what you're focusing on is the very large explosive initial impacts and the fact that there was very high concentrations in those particular areas, and that can't be explained through the normal explanations of meat markets or anything else.
By the way, the Chinese themselves, in the first brush, the first paper that appeared in Lancet in mid-January, showed that 30% of all the early cases through late November, December, could not be traced to any wet market, But of course, the first reports, it was the Wuhan wet, a seafood and meat market. But when they actually did the tracking of all of the cases they looked at, a third of them could not be tracked to that meat market or any meat market. So they already knew that it was something unconnected to the meat markets and seafood markets through December and in January. But I genuinely believe, just from the behaviour of the Chinese government, that they had already, because they had the genetic tests available, they had the PCR tests and the sequencing, they had already done swabbing. I might get contradicted. They said, no, we never did that. But their behaviour says that they knew that a massive region of central China had to be contaminated because they shut it down, and they did it rationally because they knew it was something in the environment. It was nothing to do with anything coming from a wet market. But look, contradicting that was the Chinese encouragement of this animal jump theory. Because at the same time as they were publishing stories like that in the Lancet, they published another one in another journal trying to justify it jumping from one animal, hop, step and jump from this animal to that animal to human via pangolins, and going from an avirulent form to a virulent form suddenly when it jumps to human, and they encouraged that. There was 50 authors on that paper, and it's very disturbing what's going on in terms of misinformation from a scientific point of view.
So a couple of points. So the first one is, when in January we saw people in China, for example, dying in the streets, this was because of the particles coming in a large dose from the stratosphere down onto the Earth. People absorbed a large dose, and that's why we saw those particular images. So obviously what you're saying is we haven't seen this in Australia yet, so we haven't had a large dose. And really what we're dealing with in Australia is human-to-human transmission.
Yes.
Now, obviously, if COVID-19 is a airborne virus, and it is actually, it's sort of coming from the sky, the whole philosophy of social distancing, you're saying that carries little scientific or medical basis.
It's all those other precautions I talked about. A face mask, washing your hands, having gloves on, assuming your car, your keys, your hair, your clothes, everything you've worn out is contaminated to some degree. Your dogs and cats are all contaminated. So when you're stroking them and bringing them into the house and putting them on the couch, you're spreading it everywhere in the house. You see, all those sorts of things, they're common sense, derivative explanations, for what's happened. But it's the sort of thing that the general population should be aware of, because everyone then, once they know that, they can, okay, it's like a dust storm coming in from Central Australia. We just can't get the dust on us. Well, if you think like that, you've got a better chance of handling it than the social distancing and all the others. And it's all common sense, logical stuff if you accept the first premise of what I said. Yes.
Right. But presumably there's still a place for trying to stop the secondary transmission, because you said earlier on that there is still evidence of secondary transmission and, people travelling on planes and things. So, But you're not actually tackling the root cause issue.
No, there's no question that the transmissions go on. But just on that bit about planes, in the Northern Hemisphere, all of the main airports were heavily contaminated. Heathrow, New York, Italy. That's why it's a high preponderance of baggage handlers coming down with COVID. You hear it all the time, and that's because all the baggage be on those trailers out on the tarmac have been heavily contaminated. So anyone that's travelled on an aeroplane over the last 2 or 3 months has almost certainly been exposed to COVID-19, either directly through the in the plane itself, or through all the all their personal effects that they brought with them. And I think that's largely how it's been spreading. It's been spreading through the luggage personal effects rather than the person coughing in someone else's face. It's environmental contamination that has spread it by jet planes and to cruise ships, by the way, because cruise ships are the same. There you jet into your location, let's say in New Zealand. You're in your 70s and 80s. You're having the cruise of your lifetime, all your life savings. You get on the ship. And it literally is like a petri dish, unfortunately, because you're in the age group and all the comorbidities where the person-to-person spread can go rampant. I've analysed the Kirkland outbreak early on in Washington State, and it was just rampant. You could see all the transfers going on in that institution. So if you have a lot of susceptible comorbids all in one space, and you let this virus loose, Bob's your uncle.
I think from my reading of your analysis there was a comet or an asteroid that hit the stratosphere on the 11th of October above Wuhan, and there was some visual pictures that showed an explosion in the air. And basically what you're saying is that from that explosion, particle dust from the stratosphere came down on Earth over a large geographical area. And that explains why we've seen a massive explosion in certain locations like Wuhan, Italy, Spain, New York, for example. But also that explains why we haven't seen some large explosions in other countries with high population densities like India or Egypt or even South America.
Yeah, it's all subject to the vagaries of the weather and infall rates and all other sort of things. Topography on the ground, whether there are mountain ranges in the troposphere pause between that and the stratosphere, and all other channeling events that encourage landfall or not of these. So yes, and we were always aware of that. What we didn't realise was the direction, the sequential direction from Tehran, Italy, Spain, and then realising it was on the north 40-degree latitude band, and then the next major population centre in direct line on that band was New York City. So that's why we thought, well, it looks like it is going to happen in New York City. If it washes down into New York, because it has to wash down from the stratosphere as well. It's not just has to be on the line.
So one of the questions I've got, Ted, there is, the Northern Hemisphere, the winds actually go the other way around, don't they? Most of the time. So I'm interested that the trajectory was effectively going in opposite directions to the wind flow.
Because I was, early on, it was in fact going across the Pacific after the outbreak in Wuhan. But we're talking about the stratosphere here, and they have different stratified wind levels. And, I'm not an expert on that. Chandra and his astrophysical friends are trying to work it out. It's not that easy, actually. You need help from meteorologists and all sorts of people to help you with that. But certainly, we know the stratosphere is the place where all meteorites fragment and explode. Before they explode, the fireball you see is the event after all the fragmentation, particularly with a loosely head carbonaceous meteorite. The fragmentation has been going on for quite a minute or two. But remember, they're coming in at great speed, and that's been fragmenting. And then you get the explosion. And in this case, it wasn't exactly over Wuhan. It was just north of Wuhan in Jilhan in China. But the angle, according to Chandra, he's worked out the physics, the angle it came in and the rotation of the Earth and all the other things that they use in their calculations, it would have, an infall at that moment coming down from the stratosphere would have targeted Wuhan. So we're pretty confident we got that sorted out.
Right. So Ted, basically what you're saying is the virus was on the meteorite or comet.
Oh, yes. Trillions of particles, a large, from the size of the burst, Chandra estimates it was tens of metres, the fragment was tens of metres inside, so that's 30-foot diameter, carbonaceous meteorite. So there would have been, that's two biological laboratories, if you like, and it was probably a fragment largely cryopreserved of cultured virus from life in space, which are all the sort of things we've studied and talked about coming from comets. Let me just finish off that previous thing. There's a long tradition in science of studying astrobiology and this sort of stuff. So we didn't come out of it suddenly, out of left field. But of course, when COVID appeared, we applied all our knowledge to try and understand what was going on. And I believe that's still the major task. We've got to understand what happened. And it's been very difficult with all the hysteria and all the screaming headlines. It's very hard to do that. So I've had to lock myself away from that because I get very upset when I see some of these headlines.
Okay, so what would the implications be for countries in the southern hemisphere like Australia?
We think that north 40-degree band, after it left Spain and went to New York, everything looks like it turned left. Now, it turned left immediately, but it got caught in the prevailing winds coming from down the Atlantic. And we think it then hit South America, Brazil. That's its biggest population target. Like China, it's a massive population. Potentially many susceptible people in Brazil. I'm only surmising, given the large numbers of ghettos and shanty towns in the big cities. So, and Brazil now is taking off, but it's on a different order of magnitude. It's an order of magnitude down from what's happened in New York. It's more akin to Russia, which was also off the 40-degree band. But the fact that it's in Brazil and it's rocketing up in the same slope as the New York curve and the Italian curve and the Spanish curve suggests that the dust cloud is in the southern hemisphere. And if history's any guide, what happens in the northern hemisphere in the flu and cold season inevitably happens down here in Australia, then it could come to Australia. Now, having said that, I don't want it to come to Australia because after what we've experienced in Australia, if we got a dusting now, I think the country is emotionally on its last legs, quite frankly. Forget about economics. I think the economy's been destroyed. But if a dusting happened now in any of our major cities, the pandemonium would be just unbelievable. But let's just try and learn from what's happened. If that does happen, you've got to wear masks, you've got to wear gloves, you've got to stay indoors, you've got to wash things down, you've got to wash your hair, your clothes immediately got to be washed. You don't, put them back on. If you go out, you've got to accept that you've potentially contaminated yourself. So you've got to decontaminate yourself when you get back into your house. So every house should have a decontamination area near the door where everyone's clothed, everything just gets... And so there are ways to prevent mass outbreaks in an infall once you know what you're dealing with. The problem has been that people haven't realised what they're dealing with. So that would be my recommendation. I just hope it doesn't happen, but it definitely is in the southern hemisphere. And if the history is any guide with the prevailing winds through South Africa and then to Australia, it's certainly taken off in in Nigeria. If you look at the Nigerian curve, it's starting to rocket just like Brazil. That means that, and I'm going from our world in data. I survey many countries for their case rates, and I'm not just saying it lightly. Nigeria is certainly going up, but South Africa is not, for some peculiar reason, at the moment. It hasn't really got to the Indian Ocean, as far as I can tell, from monitoring places like Madagascar and other places at the moment. But our winter is not our heart of our winter is not for several months away, so anything could happen. I just hope it doesn't get here. I think all of the economic firepower has been blown apart in Australia now. We don't have anything reserved to deal with a major infall. If there's a major infall, a mini New York or a mini Wuhan, God knows how we're going to handle it, given we've already spent all our money. That's always been my main problem with it. The rush to do what they did should have been kept in reserve for later in the year, if you're going to do something crazy like that. But that's what they did. They followed their biomedical experts and all their other economic experts and went ahead and did what they did. I just think it's just extraordinary what's happened.
So earlier in the interview, we talked slightly about the in terms of the theory that it came from the wet markets, and you sort of gave a bit of a discussion about why you think the animal jump wasn't plausible. So you did earlier say that you've got a reasonably good explanation as to why the theory of the lab, and it came from a lab, why that's not a plausible explanation as to where COVID-19 originated from. So can you to go into some details to why you rejected the lab theory?
If you were going to design a bioweapon, I've just written it down. You design it to evade the innate immune response. You design it to mutate rapidly away and keep in front of the adaptive immune response, which occurs a bit later, antibodies and cytotoxic T cells. And you design it to target lethally the whole population, right? Not just the elderly comorbids. I'm talking about lethally target the whole population at reasonable dose. You couldn't be dumping what I suspect is the dose that happened on Wuhan. You'd be dumping reasonable dose, spreading it in the wind. Okay. And then it's just not plausible to me that they would do it. But there are other reasons that are far more plausible, and they're all economic and political. Why would the Chinese design a weapon like this, then test it, assuming they've tested in the atmosphere, such that it takes out the whole entire industrial heartland? Doesn't make sense. You think about it from that point of view. It doesn't make sense.
So basically, Ted, there's the the bioweapon theory, or there's the it leaked out of a lab theory. Could it have leaked out of a lab?
Well, okay, it leaked out of a lab, but then it's got to have these other features. It's got to be able to knock out the innate immune response, which it might on the first appearances, but it's only doing that in elderly comorbids. It's not doing that in the younger people. Then it's got to mutate rapidly and spread fast, and it has that appearance, but it's certainly not as striking as people say. And then it's got to target the whole population, not just the elderly comorbids, with those features that I've just described, and that's not happening. Yeah. All my evidence suggests that's not happening. Yeah.
Right. And the point, of course, you keep making, and it's very important to reiterate it again, is that in Wuhan it was a massive spray, and therefore to go from being in the lab to being as wide as it was would be almost impossible.
Well, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of square kilometres it would be, but it would be enormous.
Yeah.
Most in central China.
Yeah.
So you're saying if it did leak from a lab and spread among a whole large area of the Earth's surface and affected a lot of people, you would see a high level of mutation in that situation. And the fact that when you study the sequences, you see a low level of mutation, that suggests that it wasn't a rapid spread of person to person.
Yes, but the bioweapon, if you're going to design it, would be designed to allow it to do that and to knock out the host's innate immune system in healthy people. That's not happening from what we see from the data. Healthy people seem to be trying to cripple it, but then spreading it. Even healthy people can only give a limited number of changes from the reference sequence, say 1 to 5. So.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I was following up on a couple of things yesterday. I noticed that there have been some discussions now about drawing correlations between direct flights from Wuhan to, for example, the Middle East, to New York and to the west coast of America, as they are basically trying to draw a sort of set of conclusion as to why we've got those locations where we've got those massive outbreaks, which is interesting because it starts to mirror some of your thinking in terms of, this is not normal.
Yeah, look, it's a very good question, but you've outlined clearly that was probably going on, and that could be part of the initial explanation. But the trouble is there were direct flights all across the planet.
Yes,
they were everywhere. They were going to Russia, Australia, India. All the places which were the dark zones in that initial band, in that initial critical few weeks where the bombs seemed to be going off on the North Latitude band. Whole of Soviet Union was showing no response. India, Pakistan, no response. Australia, the isolated outbreak. Nothing in South America. In Africa, that was virtually a blank. Greenland was nothing. Alaska, nothing. There were whole blocks of countries where there was nothing lighting up in this band. So, but I can't imagine the direct flights, as I said before, were not going on to all these other countries.
Yeah.
So it makes more sense. The explanation we've provided makes far more sense than that. Yeah.
Over the last week, we've seen Prime Minister Morrison call for a independent inquiry as to the origins of the virus. And even in the press this morning, we see that Julie Gillard has also repeated those calls for an inquiry. So it seems to me that particularly some Western governments are using, in terms of the lab theory, potentially for geopolitical, geostrategic reasons. But if there was a genuine independent inquiry like Morrison has asked for, what do you suspect that inquiry will conclude?
Well, I hope that we don't get to that point that it will conclude. I would like, and Professor Chandra Wickramasinghe, I would like two of us to present the evidence at that inquiry that we've got for an alternative explanation for this entire pandemic. This is quite different from the political agenda. So, to put it bluntly, I'd like to be on the podium presenting the PowerPoint slide showing the alternative evidence for it. Are they going to invite me or Chandra Wickramasinghe? I think it's just a political ruse at the moment, and a high stakes Cold War power game going on right now. So, but I do want the full truth to come out. But for the full truth to come out, the alternative plausible scientific explanation which we're offering, which hangs together at every level, genetic, immunologic, epidemiologic, geophysical, astrophysical, astrobiological, you name it. We've got a coherent explanation for the entire picture. We should at least be there on the podium or in the court, whatever it is, presenting the evidence for the alternative explanation, which is very different from the bioweapon lab release or the wet market theory, or that China's got it into the United States and it's sending something off in New York, which is targeting all its ethnic groups in New York. It's absurd. I'm sorry. So yeah, I'd like to be part of the international inquiry. So if Morrison, sees this interview, I think he should invite me and Professor Chandra Wickramasinghe to present the evidence for the alternative explanation.
Ted, okay, so with all the things that you've spoken about the the northern hemisphere versus the southern hemisphere, based on the evidence that we have to date, from a scientific perspective, was the lockdown of the Australian economy justified in your view?
No, we should have behaved like Sweden. I said that from day one. Before even realising that Sweden had implemented the policy that I had in my head. We look after the old people, we let life go on normally. But we be acutely aware that we don't have the situation in the Northern Hemisphere at the moment, but let life go on normally. We make the public aware of the truth about the Northern Hemisphere. That's why our story should have got out 3 or 4 months ago, and it's only getting out now. But no, it shouldn't have locked down the economy. I think that has been so destructive. I actually can't. I'm in my 70s now, so I just look to the future and think, it's terrible. I can't see both of you guys are economists, so you may have a better idea than me, but I can't see the country recovering from this for years to come. I think it was a very bad decision.
So your proposition is no lockdown, follow the Sweden model, have herd immunity, but take precautions for those who are in the high risk category.
Absolutely. That's where all the firepower should have gone. And now, with us now in the Southern Hemisphere, if the dusting does in fact come in, just be aware of all the tricks and methods you can use to protect yourself. And the authorities have got to be also aware of it too. In a funny sort of way they are. You see here in Melbourne them running around the streets with dousing guns and wiping pads and wiping telegraph poles and stop and go lights at the lights. And they're doing it, giving people employment. If you look at the people's face, they've got no interest in wiping those poles down. But that, they're trying to do it. They actually think that might be a factor. But in an infall, it's a big factor in an infall. Your pets, your car, all the things that I listed before, you have to suspect them as being part of the environmental contamination.
Sure. There will be some of our viewers who have just heard you say Sweden is the right model. Now, I know I've received some grief on social media because some Australians would say to follow the Sweden model is to accept a high degree of fatalities. So what would your response be to that?
No, not accepting a high degree of fatalities. If you're looking after old people and getting them through, most you'll get through. There are very old people who will unfortunately pass away in the cold and flu season, whether it's COVID-19 or not, by some other cold or flu. And that's why accurate diagnosis is important. But all old people are potentially vulnerable in the cold and flu season, and always have been. It'd be interesting to see what the numbers are on death rates, normal death rates this time of the year and in previous years, through these seasons. My gut feeling is that it's hardly changed at all.
On the question of having a vaccine, and we know that there's a lot of people around the world working on a vaccine. You've got some particular views about whether investing in a vaccine is worthwhile or not. So, should we be taking this sort of very conservative approach around the economy until we get a vaccine?
No, the vaccine is a pipe dream, to be quite honest. They're very blunt, using Australian bluntness. That's a pipe dream. They may or may not get it, and when they do, it's 18 months' time. This will be long gone. I think the scientific effort should be on several fronts. It should be understanding what happened, many of the issues that I've discussed, working out procedures to look after elderly people efficiently without putting them on systems that might kill them, like ventilators, understanding there are certain drugs that do help people, like prednisolone and hydroxychloroquine. There are certain categories of people that really do benefit from drugs like that. And letting the economy roll on, because the economic destruction now is going to cause more health problems later. What we've got at the moment, I think. The potential poverty in Australia now into the years to come is on a scale that I don't think any of us could possibly imagine. So I think the vaccine is just a ruse. Some of the big pharmaceutical companies are going to make a lot of money out of it. It may never get developed. It's probably better to develop, stimulate innate immunity, the sort of things that I look at with my colleagues on that how the virus tries to run the gauntlet shortly after infection. If we can get that level of immunity up, innate immunity, that will stop the virus in its track better. So there are all sorts of things like that, I think, that could be conducted. Herd immunity is the best form of immunity in the final answer to the vaccine story, because that's a genuine infection with the virus, and that 20% who did develop the immunity, they act as the protective gate against the rest of the population, because the other 80%, as I've just said, just shrug this virus off. They get rid of it through the innate immune response. So with that logical structure to immunological knowledge with this virus and other things, I think you can do things logically in our Australian economy, which will also protect people from, and also, since we know a bit more now, we can logically think it through, hopefully dampen down the hysteria.
Yeah. Well, I think that's been a very important conversation, Ted. So thank you for your time today. And, lots of very important concepts there. We are where we are, I suppose, but there's always a chance to change direction and trajectory and react perhaps better for the events ahead.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you both for having me on and aiming to actually ventilate a few of these ideas, and evidence-based ideas. They're just not ideas, it's based on science.
So, John, Ted, thank you very much for your time today. An important episode, and we'll be back with more down the track. Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of the people.